First of all, my abject apology for doing this in English. Apart from everything else, I tend to write until the last minute, which makes translation difficult, if not impossible, since it's beyond my abilities. Before the mass exodus, and I'm glad to see that it doesn't seem to be one, I'll say that the text is short. I'll read it slowly, and there will be pictures. Also, it deals, as you'll discover, with some French matters. In a context where artists are increasingly turning to writing and the form of the book as their work, I'm going to be concerned with the question of writing on and in relation to on and in relation to such works. And I want to begin by asking, when does the question of the relation between writing and artwork in its present form arise? And what can we learn from this beginning? The prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. The crucial work or non-work for what's now called art writing is, I believe, Mallarmé's Le Livre, the notes to which were published in the late 1950s by Jacques Scherer, from which we see that Le Livre was to be effectively, in the wake of Wagner, an intermediate book performance to introduce the new 20th century, had Mallarmé lived and been able to realize it. Now when writers give a reading, it's called a reading. When artists give a reading, it's called a book performance, just to clarify the terminology. Next slide, please. Next year. The poem, the poem Un coup de dé jamais n'abolira le hasard was at least in part a spin-off from this enormous project. Prochain dia. Mallarmé's poem, with its radical organization, these are the notes, by the way, from l'œuvre. Mallarmé's poem, with its radical organization of words on the page, raises the question of exactly what it is. What is it? Which, while looking forward to the art of the 20th century, is also rooted in its time in the dispute between free verse and meter. In a way, Le Livre shifts the question from what is a poem to what is a work of art in general. The question of the meter-free verse debate is that of whether there can be a law of the work when that can no longer be taken for granted, when all grounds are shaken, and therefore fundamentally it's the question of the relationship between contingency and law. The philosopher Quentin Meillassoux wrote a book on Le Coup de Dé titled Le Nombre et la Sirène, published in 2011. What, according to him, resolves the meter-free verse dispute is a number based on what may be supposed to be the number of the words in the poem, which is 707, 707. This number is encrypted in the poem. It is the secret of the poem, but entirely on its surface, not a hidden meaning, indeed nothing to do with meaning, and therefore cannot be the object of a hermeneutic. The task of criticism in this case would be not a search for meaning, not a formal analysis, not an establishment of the relation of the work to its social context, but simply to elucidate the law of the work. Here, the discovery of its number. This number, 707, relates to the disposition of the book, with the zero as the fold between the two pages, figured as a void or abyss. However, the determinacy of this number is disturbed by an undecidability, since there are in the poem certain words, notably peut-être, which Mallarmé prints with a hyphen, where it has been disputed in poetics whether these are one or two words. For something to be undecidable, it must be undecidable forever. So this opens the determinacy of the number to infinity. The throw of the dice, the poem itself, as determined by a number, did indeed not abolish chance. At stake in this is the relation between contingency and necessity. Is not Mallarmé's discovery that the poetic act consists in rendering the contingent as necessary by means of a law that is paradoxically unique? I think the first artist to really understand this and play with it was Marcel Duchamp. Prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. Notably in his 3 standard stoppages, where, as you know, he dropped 3 1-meter-long pieces of thread and then made rulers out of the way in which these fell, by chance. So these rulers would become standards like the meter. So effectively turning a contingent event into a law. Duchamp understands that the question of art has become that of turning contingency into rule. We can also consider, in relation to this, his attitude to the breakage of Le Grand Vers, with which he was, in fact, very pleased. As I have suggested, in relation to this, writing on art becomes not the description of appearance, the interpretation of meaning, the analysis of form, etc., but the determination of the law of the work. For example, the number and its undecidability. That this has been done by a philosopher suggests that it is something distinct, both from the affective, sensible dimension and the domain of practical judgments of quality. The determination of the law is prior to judgment or phronesis. Next slide, please. This raises the question of the relation between the literary and the artistic, which is posed in the mythically first artwork of Marcel Duchamp, where he sacrifices his poet self to become a visual artist in the hope of finally being able to sell his work. So this is very much a reflexive relation, in fact, to context and institution. This is the Pense Bête, in which he rendered his unsold volumes of poetry unreadable by embedding them in plaster. And of course, we'll be hearing more in a moment about porteuses from Jean-Philippe Antoine. Is the condition of the artistic, therefore, a certain unreadability from the literary point of view? As he rendered Le Coup de Dé, could I have the next dia, please? The poem is something to be looked at and not read. Is it an object then? Writing continues to feature in his work. Could I have the next prochain dia? Writing continues to feature in Bourta's work, but as decor. I will argue that this approach to the relation between the artistic and the literary has fundamentally changed of late. First, I want to consider a couple of different kinds of relations between work, world, writing, and subjectivity. Prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. In the installations of the Belgian artist Joël Teurlinckx, which always involve writing, or almost always involve writing, we see an extreme expansion of the work to the universe through its encyclopedism, its inclusiveness. The installation, by analogy with the book as encyclopedia, prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. But there is a double exigency. On the one hand, the assumption that the world can be contained in the book installation. On the other hand, that at some fundamental level, the world is infinite and cannot be encompassed. It's hard to read, but this is writing on the wall of the previous installation, which depended on the discovery in her archive of 2 cassettes from an early computer, and transcribing these cassettes, she found various forms of writing by her and her daughter in various different languages, which were copied onto the wall, both in the form of scanned steel strips and as a translation in her handwriting. On the one hand, the space of the exhibition is equated to a book of pages, a prochain. And this is her lexicon of terms in French for her retrospective, or part of it. A prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. On the one hand, the assumption that the world can be contained in the book, on the other, that it can't be. On the one hand, the space of the exhibition is equated to a book of pages. On the other, these are largely blank, and this is another work by Joël Teurlinckx, which consists of pages on the wall, which are then subsequently made into a book. The blank or void circumscribed by the objects and traces indicates the place of the real. It is in this sense that Teurlinckx bends Mallarmé's phrase from Le coup de dé that il n'y aura eu lieu que le lieu, which goes on, of course, sauf peut-être une constellation. Does the installation become a constellation? A constellation is at some level purely contingent. Its existence depends on a projection and an interpretation. Is that, after all, the work of the critic? We could take the circumscribed void as the place of the event and the trace of the becoming event of the work, as traced by Giuliano Sergio yesterday, so that that which is in the installation becomes a kind of documentation, and the exhibition an archive of what will have happened. For the critic, the question might be, does the writer participate in the work or write on it? Joël Teurlinckx has been very resistant in the past to the inclusion of critical writing in her catalogues, which she designs herself effectively as artists' books. The implication is that the writing would form part of her work. When she included essays and critical writing, prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. Et prochain. The pages have been printed in the catalogue to her retrospective in 2013 to 14 as images of photocopies or scans, suggesting both that the criticism is represented and becomes a physical object. A parallel here might be with writing as décor in Brotaz. Prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. James Coleman's contribution to the series of exhibitions titled Revolver 2, which I co-curated in London in 2014 to 15, involved an extreme contraction of the work and expansion of its title. Prochain dia. The outwork becomes the work because Coleman's work only exists in the form of the title in the list of works. So the rather long title you see is the title of Coleman's work. And it is the work itself. In fact, we had to make a list of works in order to accommodate Coleman's work. In the case of Coleman, what we read is a story of reverse causality. If we apply this to the work, we get something like the work will have become what it is, a future anterior. The cause is projected into the future. This is a temporality of the work of art as law, in answer to the question of what makes a contingent event necessary. As Jean-Christophe Antoine said yesterday, critique détermine son préalable. We shouldn't forget that criticism is also about pleasure, but what kind? I agree with Georges Banu quoting Barthes that the pleasure of criticism is perverse. This means, of course, that it takes up a certain diversionary relation to the law. In the terms of Jacques Lacan, this may involve the substitution of a father, if not the obscene father, for the father of the law. I suppose one could say le père du nom to adapt le nom du père. Prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. One of Vaux's works is an indefinite edition of a letter from a French missionary in Tonkin, Théophane Vénard, to his father the night before he was to be executed on 2nd of February 1861, in which the description of his coming martyrdom is described in somewhat ecstatic terms. Prochain dia. The form that this work takes is a letter in beautiful calligraphy by Danvau's father, who doesn't actually understand French, so he's effectively drawing a sequence of letters. The idea is that his father will go on writing these letters to order, effectively, I guess, until he himself is no more. This raises the question of the relation of the signifier to the letter, which is the hinge between writing and jouissance. The pervert, in effect, refuses to let letters become differential signifiers in order to maintain his or her jouissance. From the pleasure of beauty to art as the sanctum of jouissance, arguably this puts the artist in the position of a psychotic who has found a way of sustaining his or her production, a case of what is now called ordinary psychosis, and the critic in the position of a pervert. And incidentally, my forthcoming book of essays is titled after Octave Manoni's characterization of the position of the fetishist, Je sais bien, mais quand même. Prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. I now want to return to the question of the relation between the literary and the artistic in relation to a project by the Swedish artists Goldin and Celebi. They announced themselves as Goldin plus Celebi, as if they were a corporation or a consultancy. This novel, the story of the novel, brings together two forms of withdrawal. Georges Bataille's Acéphale, one of the reasons for the title Headless, which existed both as a journal and a secret society, and the idea of a limited company called Headless, registered in an island offshore tax haven. the novel is presented as not by Goldin and Celebi, and I'm sure is written by a ghostwriter, but is presented with the author as initials, and it's the initials of a character who appears in the novel itself, as does the ghostwriter. So the novel is, in a way, the story of the ghostwriter trying to write the novel commissioned by Goldin and Celebi on the offshore tax haven and batailles acéphales. Prochain dia. One of the things that we might consider is the relationship of fiction to its effects in terms of the idea of something like a real fiction. I mean, this is in thinking about what is the distinction between fiction in a literary novel and fiction in a novel that forms part of an artwork. Obviously, literary writers, Flann O'Brien and others, have played with the idea of fiction to the point of including the author in the fiction itself. But there's something slightly different, I think, going on in the work by Goldin and Celebi. Prochain dia, s'il vous plaît. For example, the offshore company itself is a fiction. The notion of an offshore company is a fiction, which has a real effect of depriving the countries in which the company operates of tax revenue. So all three forms of withdrawal, Bataille's secret society, the offshore company, and Goldin and Celebi's headless project, raise questions of sovereignty and bring together the crisis of the 1930s, the rise of fascism, with the crises of sovereignty today. I'm nearly finished. In relation to a work like Goldin and Celebi's Headless, is criticism itself fictionalized, drawn into the game, as it were? Or is it an agent of defictionalization? This would be to remove the possibility of withdrawal on which the work plays. In a sense, criticism or writing on the work would prevent it from withdrawing into its own fictional status. It's quite possible that somebody could pick up the novel by Goldin and Celebi, which is printed in the form of a cheap airport novel, and simply, read it as a thriller, and it works very effectively, in fact, on that level. It seems to express the desire to disappear as a work of art. And then, of course, it doesn't want to disappear as well, because only by not disappearing, only by appearing as a work of art, does it maintain its reflexive and critical relation, perhaps, to society. And then is criticism going to become a part of the object? Goldin and Celebi don't speak for the work themselves. They send an emissary to speak on their behalf. So the artist's talk becomes a kind of fictional element of the project as a whole. So that it could be argued that criticism is something that the withdrawal needs in order to remain an artistic gesture. In a sense, it has to fail, Goldin and Celebi's project of withdrawal, and criticism in this case becomes the agent of its failure, which is surely also its success. In this case, criticism both participates in and figures the situation of art today that wants to withdraw from capital, from its situation, but without becoming invisible. In a world where we depend on traces, and every trace is registered, it is very hard to disappear except by becoming someone else. That someone else would be something like a real fiction. So a self-fictionalization would be a form of withdrawal. But as Golden and Seneby show, with the offshore company, Headless, withdrawal into fiction is itself a dimension of capital. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Je commence déjà à parler portugais. J'allais commencer à parler en portugais.
Why not?
Bien. On ouvre donc les questions, pour les prises de parole de la salle. On commence par qui?
I should be able to manage the questions in French, hopefully. Somebody can help.
Il y a quelqu'un qui a demandé le micro? Non? Ah, j'ai quand même Jean-Philippe Antoine au bout de la table qui nous demande la parole.
Oui, je me demandais. I will say it in English also. Je me demandais si finalement cette sorte de croisement entre l'écriture et puis des arts, qui sont implicitement définis plutôt comme arts visuels. Dans les arts, il me semble que au moins depuis le XVIIIe siècle, l'écriture est justement extrêmement liée à la constitution d'un espace critique. Je dirais depuis la fin du XVIIIe siècle jusqu'à une date récente, les gens qui écrivent dans l'art, ce sont des critiques ou des philosophes, des écrivains littéraires. C'est assez varié, mais il y a une masse extrêmement forte. Et alors là, je rapprocherai peut-être un peu de ce qu'a dit Claude Burgelin à propos de la critique littéraire, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a effectivement... je pense aussi qu'il y a beaucoup de critiques aujourd'hui dans des lieux qui sont peut-être plus qu'on attend, qui ont changé, mais ça existe. En même temps, il y a quand même au moins un certain niveau de visibilité. Il y a un problème de visibilité de la critique. Et je me demande si cette recrudescence très très forte, c'est effectivement dans les projets qui se définissent, eux, comme artistiques et pas comme des projets critiques, s'il n'y a pas une sorte de prise en charge par les artistes de cet espace qui est devenu vacant, au moins sur le plan de la visibilité. Et effectivement, je crois que c'est vraiment des questions de politique, de visibilité qui sont en jeu. Et c'est effectivement très intéressant. Ça fait naître des paradoxes énormes que Michael Newman a vraiment très bien cerné. Donc, par exemple, cette idée que c'est le statut d'œuvre d'art revendiqué pour des objets qui ont toute l'apparence d'être des écrits sous toutes les formes publiables d'écrits, que c'est ce statut d'œuvre d'art qui fabrique la possibilité d'une validité critique de cette œuvre.
Okay, it's okay. I can handle that. I mean, maybe the problem is that the critical space, which was opened from the 18th century, can no longer be taken for granted, and that I think for at least two reasons, probably more. One of them would be that critique is recuperated as, a part of the, not necessarily just marketing, but as a part of the work itself in some sort of real sense. It's written in a catalogue. Criticism is also publicity. So maybe in relation to the idea of publicity, it becomes a part of the system for the production and dissemination of the work. The other reason lies a little bit behind why I decided to call my book Je sais bien mais quand même, which is of course a relation to fetishism, which has to do with holding two different contradictory positions simultaneously. You know, I know very well the mother doesn't have a penis, but all the same I'm going to behave as if she does have one by creating the fetish, which is the last thing seen before the traumatic vision. And I think that relates also to the affectivity or lack of it of critique. You know, the problem with critique is it not that you're telling people what they already know? And their attitude is, I know very well, but I'm still going to go on, you know, buying commodities and enjoying myself. So I know very well the art is a commodity, but all the same, I'm going to enjoy it. And then, you know, if critique has lost its separate space, its space apart, insofar as perhaps there is no more apart, and if its effectivity has come into question, what can the response be? And I think, you know, Goldin and Celebi are dealing with this situation, in a sense, making a critical work, but a critical work that is also about the response to this, if you like, crisis of critique, where the only way that seems to be left is a form of withdrawal. So artists who want to withdraw from art, maybe critics who want to withdraw from critique, but I think what they show quite effectively is that withdrawal is itself part of what one might want to be the object of critique. So one is participating in the same kind of structure that would also involve the fiction of the offshore company.